Alright, so we are starting off this chicken coop by digging some post holes, and although I started off with a gas-powered post hole digger, it broke down almost immediately, so I ended up having to dig the other 8 by hand. Not the end of the world, luckily the weather was nice. I then get some help from the family to get them in their proper location and nice and straight and level. For the concrete, we did a dry pour technique, and I would not recommend this. I think best case scenario, it saves you like 10% of the time at the cost of maybe 20% of the strength. Next up, I'm building the trusses for the roof, and proper engineered trusses are built at a dedicated facility with big fancy pressing machines. I'm just using mending plates and 2x4s because this isn't rocket science, this is a chicken coop. I think we had a pretty good system for installing these trusses, considering it was just the 2 of us. Once we got the first one installed, I then added a 12-foot long 2x4 just to help keep it from teetering, especially until we got the second set of trusses in, where I could then add a 2x4 between them to start to square everything up. Oh, I probably should explain our design here. This is basically a modified pole barn chicken coop, and we came up with this design because we couldn't really find anything online that was suiting our needs. We don't have an even ground here, everything is sloped in 2 directions, so it didn't make a lot of sense to spend the time moving the earth to try to get the ground perfectly flat. Also, we wanted the chicken run to have a roof on it, and we wanted it to be integrated to the front. So we settled on this design, which is basically just a pole barn with a chicken coop built into the front. One thing I want to point out here, on those front posts, I notched those so that the posts would be flush with the truss, and that will come into play later when we do the exterior cladding to make sure that everything is nice and flat. What we're doing here is we are applying a waterproof sealant to the entire floor, and then I'm flipping the floor upside down so that the sealed and waterproof side is underneath. And I'm doing this because unfortunately I've been under a lot of wooden buildings in my life, and it seems like the subflooring never holds up as well to the humidity and moisture as the 2x6s. The plan is to have this chicken coop last over 50 years, so we're taking a lot of these little precautions along the way. Next up is installing the second layer of the subfloor, and I could have gone with a thicker single layer with tongue and groove joints, and that would have worked out just fine, but I found that doing 2 thinner layers where they're glued together and overlapping seems to last a little bit longer and ends up with a more rigid floor. Next up, I need to build the walls, and for that I get the help of my little man. There's nothing too fancy going on here, just general 16-inch on-center 2x4 construction, similar to most walls on most houses. Next up is our exterior cladding, and for that we're doing 1/2-inch plywood over a nice layer of our Great Stuff Pro construction adhesive that I like so much. We did bring the chickens out just to supervise and make sure that the quality is up to par, since of course they're the ones that are going to be living in this coop. For the windows, we're going with some rather large antique windows that Lisa found on Facebook Marketplace, so I go ahead and cut out the opening for those before I get started on the paint. Then I whip out the Greco paint sprayer and coat the whole thing in the same waterproof decking paint that I used on the underside of our subfloor. The last thing I had to do before installing our metal roof was to add a water barrier over just the coop portion of it, and the purpose of that barrier is because the underside of these metal roofs get an awful lot of condensation developing on them, so that will help prevent our insulation from getting wet in the future. So here are those antique windows I was telling you about, and the first thing I did was a lead test. You see the green side tested negative, and then the white side actually tested positive. That's why it looks a little bit red there. So it's not the end of the world, but I do need to be a little bit careful. That's why I'm wearing the respirator here while I'm cutting it, and I am avoiding any sanding. Once we get a couple of layers of paint on it, it's not something we need to worry about, but it's just a little precaution I like to take. So I told you guys I was not a fan of the dry pour method that we used on the 8 initial posts, so I decided to add one more post while I have access to this area. Then we move on to the interior, where I've already done a layer of insulation on the ceiling here, and then I install it with more of that 1/2 inch plywood. The plan was initially to use 1/4 inch finished plywood on the entire interior, but I had some extra 1/2 inch plywood lying around, so we decided to use that on the ceiling. For the walls, however, we did use the 1/4 inch finished plywood. That way we could use a polyurethane sealant in the future and maintain that natural wood look. Next up, we move on to the exterior, where we installed the chicken cloth over the run. And I don't know why they call this chicken cloth, because it's really like a metal that's vinyl coated, but I didn't name it. I then have to add one more post, and that's because I wasn't exactly sure where I was going to put the gate, but we finally decided that we wanted up against the house on this side, so I add another post just to give it something to mount to. We will eventually be running power to this coop, so I go ahead and wire up the interior with a few outlets and lights and then a couple porch lights for the outside. I then move on to installing our front door, and just like our windows, we're going with an antique one that Lisa found on Facebook Marketplace, so I have to cut it to the right size, and because this is not a pre-hung door, I did have to build the frame from scratch. Now that the door is properly sized, I can then remove it and do some much needed repairs, including relocating our door handle. I did have to fiberglass over the location of the old handle, and for that I'm using a short strand fiberglass repair. So for the interior of the door, you saw me go with just a basic black paint. But for the exterior, we wanted to get a little wild. So I looked at what I had lying around in my inventory, and I start off by doing an automotive primer, and then on top of that, I went with a heavy gold metallic acrylic enamel paint that I had left over from a forklift project I was working on. And I gotta say, I love how this door came out. Up next, we've got our back door, so I do have to add this little piece of plywood here so that I can then install our automatic chicken door. And obviously this door is another antique door just like the front door and the windows, but luckily both doors tested negative for lead. While I was finishing up the door, Lisa was back at the chicken coop, putting a polyurethane coating over the wall, but not the entire wall. For the back, we decided to go with the fancy wallpaper, and I absolutely love how it turned out. I think it matches the entire coop perfectly, especially our gold door. For the flooring, I didn't really have any opinion on what it should look like, but I was adamant that whatever we went with, it had to be one piece that not only covered the entire floor, but also went up the walls at least an inch or two. And that is to make this thing completely watertight and to prevent any water damage in the future. Water damage on wooden buildings drives me absolutely insane, and I was not having it on this coop. So I picked up this 8-foot by 12-foot sheet of vinyl from Home Depot, and I think it was pretty reasonably priced. It was like 76 bucks out the door. And then I used my 1/8 inch trowel to get this thing glued down, and then a roller to get all the air bubbles out, and we were good to go. Next up is installing an awful lot of trim, so I go ahead and use that same construction adhesive, not only to keep it glued together, but also to help keep the bugs out, and then I staple the trim in place on top of our vinyl floor. Again, that's just to keep any moisture that may develop on the floor from reaching the bottom of the wood and causing mold or deterioration issues in the future. For the floor, I was trying to decide what type of trim I wanted to go with, and if you guys have installed trim, you know that it is insanely expensive. So what I decided to do instead of just buying the expensive stuff from the store was to make my own from some 2x4s. A 2x4 that's 8 feet long is roughly $3, so I figured if I cut it in half and then send it through the planer, I can then coat it with a polyurethane to make it completely waterproof, and I've got a nice 8-foot piece of trim for $1.50 instead of the $10 to $15 I would be spending. Next up, I'm installing more chicken cloth on the windows, and it looks like these windows are propped open, but they're actually on lift struts, so they can stay locked in an open or closed position very easily. I'll show you those in greater detail later. And then on the front door here, I needed to add a stopper because if the door opened all the way, it would make contact with that window. Obviously, I don't want that to happen. And then a lot of the stoppers that they sell are built into the hinges, and they seem to put a lot of stress on the door in like odd spots, so if a wind gust catches it, it can do some serious damage. So I'm using a little bit of a beefier bracket that I had lying around just to help keep this door nice and safe. Next up, I'm building what is essentially a poop deck. It's basically a shelf that sits underneath the perch that the chickens will spend most of their time on, so that when they poop, it lands in the sand and it's super easy to clean out. Up here in the corner, I'm building a platform as well as a ramp to lead up to it, just to help the chickens get onto the perch a little bit easier. On the top of the ramp, I'm adding a metal bracket, and then on the platform side, I'm adding some insert nuts to make this ramp easily removable for when we do like a yearly deep cleaning. Next up is some finishing work with my daughter. We did the outlet covers as well as the top interior trim, and then we sealed up the poop deck along with the ramp. Here are those lift struts on the exterior windows that I was telling you about. You simply pull them open and then they stay in that locked position to help get a nice breeze when it's warm out, and then you can just push them and they stay closed when it's cold out. Back on the run side, I've got to build a little ramp to help the chickens get down into the run, and it's basically built the same way as the one in the interior, just a little bit stronger because humans will walk on this one. Next up, we've got a ton of sand that we need to get from the back of my truck into the run, and I mean that literally. It's 2,000 pounds of washed sand. Next up, I get some help from my little buddy, finishing up the chicken cloth in the run. Alright guys, so we are not quite done with the chicken coop, but we are ready to introduce the chickens to it. And before we can do that, we have to cover the flooring with the hemp bedding, and once we do that, it will no longer be this beautiful. So I wanted to show you guys around before we do that. So here's the chickens' perspective on their way up the ramp and onto the perch. And this is their view in the morning when they head down the ramp and out the back door. Lucky chickens.
Want to explore? Want to feel it? Ooh, this is in your feet.
Welcome into your coop. I'm Nuggy, coming in with my new friends.
And the final one to step foot in this coop. Good girl, Blue.
Now, of course, this chicken coop is not done yet, but we wanted to get the chickens in there as soon as possible so that they can start to understand that this is their new home. We still have to do a gate into the run and then the landscaping, which is what we're working on right now. And now we are on to the last major thing we've got to do, which is the gate. Now, although you saw me build that entire structure out of wood, I cannot stand working with wood. I am a metal guy. I prefer it, especially wooden gates. Those things always seem to sag, and it drives me nuts when you have to kind of lift up the gate a little bit to get it to open or close. So we're going with all metal here. I'm using mostly spare parts. We've got a 3/4 inch square tubing for the basic frame, and then I use also some 1/2 inch square tubing that I had lying around, along with what you see right here, which is the expanded metal that was left over from my most recent build, which was the custom pizza truck that I shipped off to Chicago. And then I'm leaving this portion at the top open because I wanted to do a custom bead roll. Lisa tried really hard to make this coop not only functional but also beautiful along the way, and after doing that gold front door and then doing the wallpaper on the inside, it was looking so nice that I thought it really just needed something to make this gate pop. So I decided to freehand draw a chicken on it, and then I used my bead roller to bead roll out that chicken. Once I finished the chicken, I decided that I wanted to do a double diagonal quilt pattern in the background, but after doing one set of diagonals, I thought it looked really good as is, so I just welded it in like that. So I gave the gate one last test fit before paint, and that's just to make sure that everything that I need to weld onto it is welded onto it, because it's obviously a lot harder to weld after it's been painted. And then I shot it with my all-time favorite paint, which is Hot Rod Black from Speedo Coat, and then on top of that black, I did the heavy metallic gold that matches our front door, and I absolutely love how this gate turned out. Alright guys, so it has been about a month since we finished our chicken coop, and before I finish this video, I wanted to give you an update on how it's actually working as a coop. So at the moment, our little ladies are foraging outside of the run. We have done a few little upgrades here. You can see on the side, we've got this water bucket with a 5-gallon bucket that then goes to our little low pressure drip system. We also have our food on the corner here. How's it going, ladies? That good, huh? I did put up some motion lights just to help keep the predators away. We do have a latch on this back door that I didn't show you. That way we can keep it locked open during the daytime if it's an extra hot day like it is today. Inside, everything is working out about as well as can be expected. The hemp is doing a fantastic job with any poop that ends up on the floor. And then the sand up here is super easy to clean out. Our perch did decide to warp on us, which is a little bit annoying. That's kind of part of the reason why I hate working with wood, but no big deal, I'll just cut a new one. We do have a nesting box over here that I think I forgot to show you guys. It's currently closed up because our little ladies are not producing eggs yet, but we will remove that piece of wood and then put one of those little plastic eggs in there as soon as the time comes for that. And I showed you guys our light switch here that goes to our interior light. That's not hooked up at the moment. I'm gonna do a direct buried cable eventually, but right now we just have it hooked up to where we can run it on an extension cord. But I don't think I mentioned we've got two 4-inch vents up in the corner there, and then on the other side, we have a single 6-inch vent. And they do a really good job at moving air, because when the wind comes in from this side, the way the A-frame is set up, it kind of acts as a bit of a sail and forces air in through that vent and then forces it out through that vent, so the air doesn't stagnate too much in here. All in all, we are super happy with how this coop turned out. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and write those in the comments section below. We'll try and address those. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you guys later.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.